Welcome to the Workflow Podcast. If you enjoy this show, please like, share, and or subscribe. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Workflow Podcast for the first episode in our new series on optimizing your body and mind. Of course, the first series looked at the foundations of performance at work, and now we're going to look at really the foundations of how to get the most out of your mind and body insofar as the physiological aspects are concerned. And of course, when we think about body and mind, three key variables come to mind, and that would have to be sleep, nutrition, and movement. And today we're going to talk all about sleep, which is essentially Mother Nature's ultimate biohack. We hear a lot of things today about activated turmeric and supplement X and supplement Y and whatnot, but at its core, sleep is far more potent when it comes to improving a diversity of functions, when it comes to improving your physiology, your health, your mindset, your mood, your performance, absolutely everything. In fact, you can think of sleep as being, say, the foundation upon which a cake rests. Previously I used the analogy that supplements are like the icing on the cake. Well, sleep is really the foundation, and then exercise and nutrition are the additional ingredients that go into that cake. So maybe a cheesecake, maybe it's the cookie crumble, which, as I've alluded to, is the best bit of the cake. Now, when I say things about, say, activated turmeric and all these supplements, well, the supplement industry nowadays is worth $4.2 trillion. The global market is worth $4.2 trillion. And so it can sometimes become very overwhelming when you start thinking about what to eat, what to consume, what kind of exercise to do. Should you do CrossFit, yoga? Should you pursue Pilates? Should you do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? There are so many different things you can do to optimize your body and mind. But really, at its absolute core, if you only have the time or the inclination to get just one thing right, then sleep would have to be the way to go. Like I said, it is the foundation upon which everything else sits on. And one of the foremost thinkers in this space would have to be Dr. Matt Walker, who also wrote a very popular book on the subject called Why We Sleep, The Science of Sleep and Dreams. So some of today's lessons will come out of that book, while others will come out of numerous studies that I'll allude to during the episode. So those functions that sleep essentially enriches extend to memory, learning, mood, emotional regulation, decision-making, creativity, recall, you name it. Sleep helps us get better at all of these things. But the thing about sleep is, in the West, about 2/3 of people aren't getting the recommended 8 hours sleep. Now, just on that, the studies that I've looked at suggest that most of us need 7 to, closer to 8 hours sleep to function at our optimal level. Now, there are people in the populace, a small percentage of people in the populace who can get away with less, but most of us really need to be aiming for that 8 hours. The other aspect that I wanted to touch on there is that you don't know you're sleep deprived when you're sleep deprived. So you might be one of these people who says things like, oh no, I can crush it on 5 hours sleep a night. But perhaps you don't know what it feels like to be on 8 hours sleep a night. You don't know how your work would, how much better you'd perform at work, perhaps how much better you'd perform in your personal relationships, how much more motivation and energy you'd have to go to the gym to explore interests outside of work. We don't know we're sleep deprived when we're sleep deprived, just like we don't know how bad we feel when, say, we've been chronically overweight for most of our lives. We don't know what it feels like to be fit and healthy and at a reasonable body mass index level. There are so many things in life where we just normalize them and they become our body's sort of comfortable state of homeostasis. And that doesn't make it right or optimal. It just means that that's where we're comfortable and that's what we've always known. But it definitely doesn't mean that's where we are our best selves. And I was also one of those people. One of those people who used to say things like, "Nah, man, I can crush it in 5 hours a night." I would routinely get up at 5 a.m. and on the back of maybe sleeping 5 or 6 hours and go to the gym and go to the office and get stuff done. And that would be a big part of my identity. I would chest beat around that. And the only thing I stopped short of was jumping onto Instagram and posting a photo of my wristwatch at 5 a.m. every day, like former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink likes to do, although admittedly he does it at 4:30 a.m. But the science does suggest that we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we're sleeping less than, say, 6 hours a night, if we're not aiming for that 8 hours. And that's because it does impair many of our short-term cognitive functions, but also can result in the buildup of beta amyloids in the brain, which precede neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia as well. So your current self and your future self are both well served by getting more sleep. Now, when it comes to sleep, there are two types of sleep you should be aware of. Non-rapid eye movement sleep, or NREM, we'll call it, which is basically the shallow sleep. And number two, rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, or deep sleep, which, as you can ascertain, is referencing deeper states of sleep. Now, those names themselves hint at something. So rapid eye movement sleep, when you are in deep sleep, your muscles basically lock up. You can't move essentially, but your eyelids are moving rapidly. Whereas that doesn't occur with non-rapid eye movement sleep, and dream sleep tends to occur in the REM deep state. Now, we get most of our REM, our deep sleep, towards the latter end of a 6 to 8 hour sleep cycle. So this is important because if you're only getting 5 or 6 hours sleep a night, you're probably missing out on a good chunk of your potential REM sleep. So 60 to 90% of our REM we get between the 6th and 8th hour of an 8-hour sleep cycle. So the way sleep works is you have cycles where you essentially cycle between non-rapid eye movement sleep, shallow sleep, and deep sleep throughout, say, an 8-hour sleep cycle. But you start off with very short bursts of rapid eye movement sleep, followed by longer non-rapid eye movement sessions. It's only towards the latter end of that sleep cycle where that deep sleep gets longer and longer. And if you're on the YouTube, you can see that on the screen right now. So this podcast is not a general well-being, health optimization podcast. It is a podcast about getting the most of yourself when it comes to work. So when we're looking at the topic of sleep, we're going to look at it from the perspective of work. So let's get into that particular aspect of this discussion. So number one, focus, attention, the ability to get shit done. That's core to performing at work, of course. Now let's get into some of the science on focus and sleep. A 2007 study on the topic, which looked at sleep deprivation. Now there are two types of sleep deprivation, one being chronic acute sleep deprivation, where you are kept awake for, say, between 24 and 72 hours. And then partial sleep deprivation, which could be sleeping, say, 3, 5, or 7 hours a night. Now, in both of these cases, the researchers found that that sleep deprivation, whether it was chronic acute or partial, impaired our attention and our working memory. Now, this also feeds into things like decision making. It feeds into the quality and quantity of the work that we produce, and of course, the compounding effect of that over an extended period of time in terms of where we get in our work, how much closer we get to our goals, whether we get promoted, is obviously something that cannot be understated. In this particular study, they also compared several groups with each other. So there was a group that slept 3 hours a night, 5 hours a night, 7 hours a night, and then a control group of 9 hours a night. And it turned out that in all of these groups, there was a linear relationship between sleep and the impairment in cognitive function. It's also worth noting that the 7 hour a night group also demonstrated a deterioration in their ability to perform on a particular test that was given, so in terms of speed and performance, compared to the 9 hour a night group. So even sleeping 7 hours a night was shown to deteriorate performance. Moving on from focus to something that's fundamental, especially today where things are moving so fast, creativity and problem solving. Now, looking back on shallow sleep and deep sleep, shallow sleep supports the storage and strengthening of new facts and skills, whereas REM sleep or deep sleep is about connecting the dots between those facts and skills, which is essentially what creativity is all about. I mean, those of you who read, say, Clayton Christensen, rest his soul, his book on the innovator's DNA found, you would know that some of the key attributes behind an innovator or an entrepreneur is things like challenging the status quo, comfort with ambiguity, and associational thinking, which is essentially connecting the dots. And that is the essence of creativity, something that Franz Johansson also wrote about in his book, The Medici Effect, which is all about the Medici family in Florence, in Italy, who brought poets and sculptors and painters and engineers and architects to Florence, and that preceded a cultural artistic revolution, also known as the Renaissance, because you had all these different people and different skill sets working together to come up with fundamentally, transformatively new things. So on creativity and sleep, this is something that's been studied ad infinitum, I think so, over the last 100 years, and a recent literature review looked at 11 specific studies. Now, what they found was that shallow sleep reflects frontal lobe activity, which, echoing what we've just talked about on creativity, this is absolutely important for divergent thinking. So those of you who are aware of, say, design thinking, you diverge on a number of different potential solutions around a specific problem, and then you converge and you bring them back to maybe 3 to 5 solutions that you can then pursue. But you can't do that without first diverging. So frontal lobe activity is fundamental for that, and shallow sleep supports that frontal lobe activity. The other aspect of sleep and creativity that's definitely worth touching on is deep sleep and how it can help us solve problems that we've primed our brains to think about before we go to sleep. So Reid Hoffman famously likes to give his brain a problem to meditate on, essentially, before he goes to sleep, and he's credited that with a number of breakthroughs in his own professional and personal life. And more famously, perhaps, Thomas Edison used to, he famously only slept several hours a night, but he would also have many naps throughout his day. And he would also use these naps constructively. For example, he would take 2 metal balls as he sat at his desk. If he was pondering a problem, he would take those balls. He would then put metal canisters under his desk, and he'd basically hold his arms down, and he'd go to sleep. And as soon as he got into a place where he was in a deeper level of sleep, his muscles in his arms, or in his hands rather, would stop clenching. The balls would drop. They would hit the metal canister. It would wake him up, and then he would madly start working on that solution. And it's something that he said, that transition between wakefulness and sleep is something he credited with helping him solve many of the problems that he was working on. So furiously writing down whatever came to mind as soon as he woke up. And this is something that you might personally relate to in terms of your mornings, providing you're not one of these people who just reaches for the phone as soon as they wake up in the morning, because that's just going to block creativity, because then you're just filling your mind with incoming information. You're not giving it any time to really think. If you are one of these people who actually sits there for 5, 10, 15 minutes, doesn't do anything, you might find that part of your day might be one of the more profoundly creative parts of your day. Now, on learning and creativity, you might read a lot of books, you might listen to a lot of podcasts, you might read studies, you might speak with people, but unless you're getting enough sleep, unless you're consolidating those facts through shallow sleep and then connecting dots between them through deep sleep, a lot of it might actually go to waste, or at least some of it will go to waste. So you want to do what you can to optimize your attention of what you're reading throughout the day, so you're actually embedding it, storing it away, and then being able to retrieve it later. So sleep is fundamental for that. And before we move on from creativity, one story that I would be absolutely remiss of me not to touch on, being such a big rock and roll fan, is a story that Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones once told. And I'm going to quote him here. Here's what he said about sleep and creativity. I go to bed as usual with my guitar, and I wake up the next morning and I see that the tape is run to the very end. I think, well, I didn't do anything. Maybe I hit a button when I was asleep. So I put the tape back to the beginning and pushed play. And there, in some sort of ghostly version, is the opening line to Satisfaction. It was a whole verse of it. And after that, there's 40 minutes of me snoring. But there's the song, and it's embryo. And I actually dreamt the damn thing. So Keith Richards is telling the story of waking up, recording the opening riffs to Can't Get No Satisfaction, going back to sleep, not remembering any of it, but there was that famous riff which went on to propel the Rolling Stones into superstardom to this very day. Now, if that's not a massive endorsement for the power of deep sleep, for the power of sleep in general, then I don't know what is. So moving on from focus, from creativity towards learning. We've already kind of touched on learning in terms of shallow sleep and how it helps you retain information. But it is really worth stressing that the more shallow sleep you get, the more you will also remember the next day, and that the value of naps cannot be discounted. So you might only get 6 hours sleep a night, but if you can supplement that with, say, 20-minute naps throughout your day, that may also be sufficient. This is something that both Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla both practiced, and of course, both were not inadequate when it came to their creative exploits. So you might want to consider those 20-minute naps throughout your day. I personally am not a napper. I find that if I nap, I will just feel really groggy afterwards, but there is something to be said about that nap duration, and it's been found that 20 minutes is short enough for you to get some of the benefits from, but not long enough that you do feel groggy. So perhaps when I have napped, I've gone for longer than 20 minutes. 20 minutes is generally not enough for you to fall into deep sleep as well. And a lot of the science on that suggests that you should try and wake up in a shallow sleep cycle rather than a deep sleep cycle. So you'll also feel less disoriented and everything else. So perhaps the next time I try to nap, I should set myself a timer for 20 minutes. Moving on from learning to emotional regulation, and ultimately that feeds into mood, decision-making, how we build relationships with other people, how resilient we are in the face of difficulty, and on and on and on. And a lack of sleep has been found to make us more emotionally aroused and sensitive to stressful stimuli and events. Sleep deprivation has actually been shown to amplify emotional reactivity by 60%. So that essentially means that our amygdala, which is our threat detection system, and our prefrontal cortex, the balance between those two is actually lost, or the strong link is actually lost, and our amygdala tends to run riot. The cortisol response is something that we struggle to regulate, and we can be really moody, we can be really snappy, we won't have the patience to deal with difficult things, and of course, I don't need to tell you what that leads to, but it ultimately does make us perform at a suboptimal level. But not only that, I mean, this paves the way for terrible relationships, anxiety, depression, and potentially suicide as well. So one cannot understate, again, the emotional regulation that sleep offers. So how do you know if you're not getting enough sleep? How do you know if maybe you've been getting 6 hours sleep a night for the last 10 years? Maybe you're one of these few people who can get away with that. How do you know whether or not you're sleep deprived and just don't know it? Well, there are some questions you might want to ask yourself. And these questions are, one, can you fall back asleep at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. after waking up earlier that day? So this is perhaps something you might want to try on a weekend. Two, can you function without caffeine before noon? Or are you one of these people who absolutely needs a shot of coffee to wake up in the morning? And three, would you sleep right on through your alarm clock if it failed to turn on? Now, this is something that I tested myself. As I said, I used to be one of these people who had the 5 a.m. alarm clock set, the big hustle culture proponent back then. And what I found was when I stopped setting that alarm clock, I would sleep beyond 6 a.m., which meant that I was forcing myself to wake up at least an hour earlier than my body was ready. So these are three things that you can try to see whether or not you're sleep deprived and whether or not you need to start making some changes in your life. Now, what do those changes extend to? How can you optimize your sleep? Well, firstly, before we get into a number of different things you can do, one thing you should perhaps stop doing, now this is of course for you to decide, is drinking coffee in the afternoon. Now, why is this the case? Well, the mean half-life of caffeine has been found to be about 5 hours in healthy individuals. But that half-life can actually range from about 1.5 to 9 hours, depending on how your body metabolizes the caffeine. Yes. So potentially you could be drinking a coffee at 1 p.m. and at 10 p.m., still have half of that caffeine in your body, depending on how your body's going about metabolizing it. Similarly, if you're one of these healthier individuals who can metabolize it relatively quickly, or at least at an average rate, that 4 p.m. coffee at 9 p.m., half of it's still in your system, and that might be preventing you from falling asleep, and you might not be making that connection because, that coffee was hours ago. Surely it's not keeping me up, but potentially it could be. So here are 10 more things you can do. I'm going to get into all 10 now to optimize your sleep. Number one, set your bedroom temperature to 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, females tend to prefer the room a little bit warmer. They might prefer it to be 19 degrees Fahrenheit. This is, one of the things you often find in shopping centers, and this might speak to who controls the flow of funds and where most of those funds are essentially coming from in shopping centers. But shopping centers tend to be quite warm. The temperature tends to be tailored more towards females than males. In fact, I find it very difficult to wear a jumper or a jacket in a shopping center. I'm typically stripping layers down to a t-shirt, and if I had my way, I would walk around topless in a shopping center because I find it that warm. But perhaps my core body temperature is just a little bit warmer than the average person. So setting that room temperature is one thing. Now, if you and your partner prefer different room temperatures, you might want to invest in a chili pad blanket where you can set either side of the blanket to a different temperature, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes for you. Number two has to do with light. So firstly, you don't want to look at, or you want to try and at least decrease the amount of blue light you take in within, say, an hour or two of bed. So this is your laptop, TV, your mobile phone, most importantly, iPads and so on. That blue light is going to suppress the release of melatonin, which is obviously fundamental when it comes to falling asleep. So what you should do there, if you absolutely must look at this blue light, is perhaps put on a pair of blue blockers or blue light blocking glasses, which will suppress that light and not suppress the release of melatonin. So I've got a link in the show notes for you to some blue blocker glass retailers where you can potentially pick up a pair of those. Now, there are other things you can do outside that are absolutely free, such as dimming the lights or turning the lights off within an hour or two of going to bed as well. Now, the thing about this, just to stress before I move on, is that even, say, a bedside lamp of, say, 20 lux is enough to suppress melatonin by about 50%. Even 8 to 10 lux, say living room lights set at a low level of brightness can also suppress the release of melatonin. So even if you do have the lights dimmed, some of those blue blocker glasses may not go astray regardless. The 3, journaling. Simply getting your thoughts out of your head and onto paper go a long way in terms of calming the mind and allaying you of any anxiety you're experiencing. In addition to that, just writing down, say, 3 things that you're grateful for can help put you in a more positive mind as you head to bed. Number 4, now the science suggests that you should cool your body in order to fall asleep. Now this is something that I've found is that if I have a hot bath or go into a sauna before bed, as my body's cooling itself down, I just find myself in a really blissful state and fall asleep really easily. At the same time, you might want to try cold showers and really just cooling your body, especially if you find yourself overheating in the evening before you go to sleep. That's going to also help in terms of getting you into that shallow level sleep to begin with, and then hopefully into some deeper sleep as your night unrolls or unfurls. Number 5, don't drink alcohol before bed. So it's a bit of a misconception that alcohol helps you fall asleep. Yeah, I mean, yes, it will help you fall asleep, but the quality of that sleep won't be a natural sleep. It will be like a tranquilized sleep. And also, once that alcohol wears off, you will wake up in the middle of the night and then potentially find it very difficult to fall asleep again. So what matters is not just sleep, but the quality of your sleep. The same goes for number 6, which is not eating a large meal just before bed, because overeating, especially heavy, carby, simple carbs and spicy foods, that can interfere with your digestion and make it difficult to fall asleep. Number 7, downing a magnesium supplement before bed. Magnesium, back in 1968, there was a research paper penned by Parisi and Wacker, which found that magnesium deficiency could cause depression, behavioral disturbances, headaches, muscle cramps, seizures, psychosis, and irritability. And it has been shown to make us feel calmer after consumption. So maybe downing a magnesium supplement 30 minutes before bed is something you might want to try. Similarly, bath salts or magnesium salts, laying in a bath with magnesium salts is something that also makes our bodies generally feel a lot calmer and more relaxed. And if you're experiencing a lot of discomfort in your body, that might be something you might want to try just to put your body in a calm state before you go to bed, because that's obviously going to directly relate to how easy you fall asleep. Because if you've got all these sort of nagging pains and whatnot in your body, muscle cramps and things of that persuasion, that's obviously going to get in the way of you and your best sleep. Number 8, don't consume engaging content or media just before bed. So having grown up on 80s horror movies, which I kind of didn't watch for 20 or so years, if not longer, I recently decided I would watch the Hellraiser series. In fact, I watched the first, the second, and the third installments of Hellraiser, and I have to say I quite enjoyed them. But watching these just before bed probably wasn't the best idea. I did find it more difficult to fall asleep on those nights, and let's just say that my deep sleep dreams were a little bit more horrific than I'm usually used to. Number 9, have more sex or masturbate or do whatever you have to do, because when we orgasm, or at least when a male orgasms, that is the equivalent of 2 to 3 milligrams of Valium. Now, to put that into perspective, hospitalized patients are administered with between 5 and 10 milligrams of Valium. So it's not an insignificant amount. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why males tend to want to go to sleep after sex. Number 10, supplement. So I've mentioned melatonin earlier. You could consider supplementing with melatonin. I wouldn't recommend this as your first protocol. I would recommend all the other natural measures I've mentioned. But the good thing about melatonin is that unlike other sleep medications, it doesn't actually cause withdrawal symptoms or dependency. And I'm going to throw in a bonus round here, number 11, which is vitamin D and sunlight. So your circadian rhythm, the amount of hours your body knows to stay awake before it goes to sleep, can be regulated by the sun, or is regulated by the sun, particularly your exposure to direct sunlight. So if I wake up, say at 7 a.m., I go outside, I get some direct sunlight in my eyes, and I mean, don't stare directly at the sun, but look at the sky. If you're looking too close to the sun, if you're blinking profusely, that's an indication that you're staring too closely to the sun. But get some direct sunlight in your eyes. It's been shown that about 5 minutes of this is enough to tell your body to start the countdown to sleep, which is, say, roughly 14 hours after. So if I look outside, get some direct sunlight, nothing between me and that sun, no windshields, no windows, because that's going to suppress about 97% of the sun's rays. That's going to tell my body, okay, it's 7 a.m. now, 9 p.m. tonight, we're going to start winding down. We're going to start releasing that melatonin, and then by 10 p.m., I should be good to sleep. For so many people who work from home, or who just jump into their car in the morning, go straight to the office, don't get any direct sunlight, they're not getting the benefit of that. One thing you can do in addition to this is to supplement with vitamin D first thing in the morning. I'll have some links to some supplements, some vitamin D supplements in the show notes for you as well. But that can also help you fall asleep late at night. And just on that, make sure that you're not supplementing or dropping vitamin D pills just before bed, because that's going to tell your brain that, hey, it's time to wake up. The sun's rising. Let's set that countdown timer to wake us up in 14 hours. Of course, it won't have such a drastic effect immediately, but it definitely is not advised and will prevent you from falling asleep and getting an optimal night's rest. So there you have it. This episode was a little bit longer than our others, and I think that's just because there's so much to cover in this space. And of course, I've only scratched the surface here in terms of the science and literature on sleep. I mean, there are literally hundreds of studies, and so we have a number of links in the show notes for you to dig a little bit deeper. I really recommend checking out Why We Sleep by Matt Walker. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. And also Andrew Huberman of the Huberman Lab has a series on sleep on his podcast. I believe it's about 4 episodes long that you might also want to check out. That really is about a 4 to 5 hour deep dive into the topic. So it's something that if you want to learn more, you should definitely check out. So with that, I think I'm going to bring this episode of the Workflow podcast to a close. As always, if you'd like to read the article that this episode was based on, as well as hundreds of other articles and podcast episodes, head over to steveglaveski.com. And also feel free to connect with me either on LinkedIn or Twitter. Just search for Steve Glaveski. I'm pretty much, in fact, I am the only one in the world. Of course, Glaveski is not that common a name. So with that, I hope you are well wherever in the world you find yourself, and I will wish you an awesome rest of your day. Peace out.